The fastest way to quietly sabotage a marriage doesn't look like a fight, it doesn't look like betrayal, it doesn't even look like a mistake. It looks like a perfect wedding. A packed venue, a $200 per plate dinner, flowers everywhere, a photographer capturing every second so nothing is forgotten. And then, it's over in 6 hours. What doesn't end after 6 hours is the bill. I'm a Jazz. I have a master's in finance, and what keeps showing up in real financial data isn't romance. It's something a lot less comfortable to talk about. Debt. Not just any debt either. Debt that starts on day one of a marriage. There's a couple, Emily and Jake, not unusual, not reckless, not irresponsible. Just normal people doing what they believe they were supposed to do. They spent $34,000 on their wedding. About 150 guests at a country club. The venue charged $180 per person just for dinner. The photographer alone was $4,800. Flowers came in at $6,500. Decorations added another $3,200. A DJ, invitations, dress, cake, it all stacked up piece by piece until the total didn't feel real anymore. Because that's how it happens. Not one big decision, just 100 smaller ones that all feel justified in the moment. Family contributed some money, that helped, but not enough. So $14,000 went on a personal loan at 9.5% interest. That decision didn't feel dramatic either. It felt temporary. Manageable. Just a way to bridge the gap. Now the wedding is over. The photos are saved. The guests went home. And what's left is $14,000 of debt, plus over $3,000 in interest over 5 years. That's about $293 every single month. Not for a house, not for an investment, not for something that grows, for a party. 2 years later, the marriage doesn't look like the photos. They're sitting in counseling. And the most common argument isn't about values or compatibility or communication styles. It's money. Specifically, that $293 payment that keeps showing up every month like a reminder of a decision they can't undo. Jake resents still paying for something that's already over. Emily resents that it keeps being brought up. And now that one decision has turned into something much bigger than money. It's friction, it's stress, it's a constant background pressure that never fully goes away. That's the part nobody advertises. Because the story that gets sold is very different. The story says this is the most important day of a life. That it needs to be perfect. That the scale of the celebration should match the scale of the commitment. That cutting costs somehow means cutting meaning. That if it doesn't look a certain way, it doesn't count the same. That belief doesn't come from nowhere. It's reinforced everywhere. Venues, vendors, magazines, social media, family expectations. Every direction points toward the same conclusion. Spend more. Not because the couple wants to, because it feels like they have to, and that's where things start getting uncomfortable. Because the moment the word wedding enters the conversation, something strange happens to prices. Call a florist and ask for arrangements for a dinner party, and there's one quote. Call the same florist, ask for the exact same arrangements, but mention it's for a wedding. And suddenly the price jumps. Not a little. Sometimes dramatically. Investigations across multiple cities found that identical services labeled as wedding cost significantly more. Photography packages priced for weddings came in over 60% higher than similar packages for regular events. Catering costs per person jumped close to 80% when the event was labeled as a wedding instead of a corporate function. Same food, same service, same outcome. Different label. That difference isn't about cost, it's about perception. Because weddings exist in a category where people are more emotionally vulnerable than usual. It's one of the few times in life where spending feels justified almost no matter what the number is. And businesses know that. So pricing adapts to that reality. That's what turns a normal event into something else entirely. Something bigger. Something more expensive. Something that quietly pushes people into decisions they wouldn't make in any other context. And here's where the pressure really starts stacking. Because it's not just vendors, it's family, it's expectations. It's the idea that this event represents more than just two people. Emily didn't originally want a 150-person wedding. The plan was simple, small, about 50 people, backyard setting, something personal. But that didn't survive the conversation with family. Because a smaller wedding wasn't seen as intimate. It was seen as embarrassing. Guest lists grew. Expectations expanded. Costs followed. That's not unusual either. More than half of couples report feeling pressure from family to increase their wedding budget, and a large percentage end up going over budget specifically to meet those expectations. At that point, the wedding stops being just about the couple. It becomes a performance, a demonstration, a way to signal something to other people: status, success, stability. And here's the uncomfortable part: most of the people being impressed won't remember the details a week later. But the couple remembers the debt every month, because that's the part that stays. Now layer something else on top of this. This isn't happening in a vacuum. Over the past few decades, financial pressure on families has been increasing across the board. Debt levels have climbed. Savings have struggled to keep up. More households are operating closer to the edge than they realize. That means when a couple takes on wedding debt, it's not just one isolated decision. It's adding pressure to a system that's already under strain. And that changes the impact completely. Because now it's not just about a loan, it's about what that loan represents. Lost flexibility, delayed goals, fewer options. That $293 monthly payment could have been going somewhere else: a down payment on a home, an emergency fund, retirement savings, something that builds stability instead of draining it. But instead it's tied to something that already passed. That's where the math starts telling a very different story than the one being sold. Because money doesn't just sit still, it either grows or it costs. And this is where the idea of a $20,000 wedding starts looking very different depending on how it's viewed. On the surface, it's just a number attached to a single day. But over time, that same $20,000 has another possible path. One that doesn't get talked about nearly as much. Because if that money were invested instead of spent, something interesting happens. And this is where a simple equation starts to matter more than any centerpiece or venue choice ever could. V equals P1 plus R and V equals P1 plus R and V equals P plus 1 plus R and V equal P plus P1 plus R and V equals P plus 1 plus 1. It looks simple, almost forgettable, but it describes something powerful: how money grows over time. P is the starting amount, in this case $20,000. R is the rate of return, historically around 7% annually for something like an S&P 500 index fund. N is time, and time is where everything changes, because over 30 years that $20,000 doesn't stay $20,000. It compounds, year after year, quietly, without effort, turning into something significantly larger, not because of luck, because of math. And by the time those 30 years pass, that one decision, to spend or to invest, creates a gap that isn't small anymore. It's massive, and that's the part most people never actually visualize. Because the wedding is immediate, the cost is immediate, the experience is immediate. But the alternative, that's invisible, at least at first. And invisible costs are the easiest ones to ignore, until they're not. That invisible cost doesn't stay invisible forever. It just waits. Because while one version of that $20,000 disappears into a single day, the other version quietly compounds in the background. At an average annual return of around 7%, that initial amount doesn't just grow a little, it multiplies. Over 30 years, it crosses well beyond $150,000. Not through effort, not through timing the market, but through consistency and time. And that's where the contrast becomes impossible to ignore. One decision creates a 6-hour memory. The other creates long-term financial leverage. The difference between those two outcomes isn't emotional, it's mathematical. And math doesn't care about how beautiful the venue looked or how perfect the lighting was during the first dance. It only reflects what happened to the money after the decision was made. Now bring that back to reality. Because most couples aren't choosing between spending and investing in a clean, controlled way. They're doing something much riskier. They're spending money they don't fully have, which means the comparison isn't just between $20,000 spent versus $150,000 gained. It's between negative growth and positive growth. Because debt doesn't sit still either. That $14,000 loan at 9.5% interest isn't neutral. It's actively working against them every single month. interest accumulates, payments chip away slowly. And psychologically, that matters just as much as the financial side, because every payment is a reminder, not of the wedding itself, but of the cost attached to it. And over time, that reminder changes how the decision feels. What once felt exciting starts feeling heavy. What once felt meaningful starts feeling questionable. And that shift is where financial strain turns into relationship strain. This is the PlayStation 5, a sleek, futuristic box hiding the result of one of the most ambitious global manufacturing operations ever attempted in consumer electronics. From the outside, but with chances in 1995 to keep us in deprivating 46 lungs and better credential systems between $5,000 and $10,000. Not because the wedding itself directly causes the breakup, but because of what comes with it, the expectations, the pressure, and most importantly, the financial consequences that follow. And it gets even more specific when debt enters the picture. Couples who took on debt for their wedding were far more likely to report financial stress as one of their main sources of conflict within the first few years of marriage. That's not a coincidence. It's a pattern, because financial stress doesn't stay contained. It leaks into decisions, into conversations, into everyday life. It turns small disagreements into bigger ones. It reduces flexibility. It limits options. And over time, it wears things down. And this is where the story that gets sold starts to fall apart, because the narrative says that a bigger, more expensive wedding is an investment in the relationship, that it strengthens the bond, that it creates a stronger foundation, but the data suggests the opposite. The strength of a marriage doesn't come from how much was spent celebrating it. If anything, the financial strain created by overspending does more damage than the celebration adds value. That doesn't mean weddings don't matter. It means the price attached to them has been distorted far beyond what actually contributes to a meaningful experience. Because at the end of the day, both a $5,000 wedding and a $50,000 wedding lead to the exact same legal outcome. The difference shows up afterward, in bank accounts, in stress levels, in how much room there is to build a life instead of managing payments. And the industry behind all of this understands that dynamic better than it lets on. Because the pricing isn't random. It's structured around emotion, around urgency, around the idea that this is a once-in-a-lifetime event where cutting corners feels unacceptable. That's why the same services cost dramatically more when labeled as a wedding. That's why unnecessary extras become normalized. That's why spending beyond comfort levels feels justified in the moment. It's not accidental. It's designed. Designed to maximize how much gets spent during a window where resistance is low and expectations are high. And when that system meets families that are already under financial pressure, the result is predictable. Overspending doesn't feel like a choice. It feels like the default. And then there's the social layer. Because even outside of vendors and pricing, there's a constant comparison happening. Weddings aren't just personal events anymore, they're public displays. Shared, posted, evaluated. That creates another kind of pressure, one that has nothing to do with the relationship itself and everything to do with perception. What it looks like, how it compares, whether it meets an unspoken standard. And when that standard keeps rising, budgets tend to follow, not because couples want more, but because enough keeps getting redefined. That's how a small, meaningful event turns into something much bigger than originally intended. And once that shift happens, it's hard to reverse, because scaling down feels like losing something, even when what's being lost is actually financial stability. Meanwhile, the people the event is meant to impress move on quickly. Guests remember that the wedding was nice. Maybe they remember the food, maybe they don't. Within days, attention shifts elsewhere. Life continues. But for the couple, the financial impact doesn't fade. It stays active. It shapes decisions. It limits opportunities. It delays milestones. That monthly payment that could have been building something meaningful continues going towards something that already ended. And over time, that trade-off becomes harder to justify, especially when the long-term effects become clear. Because that's the real issue here. It's not the existence of weddings. It's the mismatch between what's being spent and what's actually gained. A meaningful celebration doesn't require financial strain. A strong relationship doesn't depend on the scale of an event, but the system surrounding weddings pushes in the opposite direction, toward more spending, more pressure, more expectations. And when those forces combine, they create outcomes that don't align with what couples actually want long term. So the question isn't whether weddings should happen. It's whether starting a marriage with financial pressure makes sense when the alternative is starting with stability. Because that initial condition matters more than it seems. It sets the tone. It shapes early decisions. It determines how much flexibility exists when unexpected things happen, which they always do. And in that context, the difference between carrying debt and having savings isn't small. It's foundational. A smaller wedding doesn't reduce the value of the commitment. It removes the financial weight attached to it. It creates space instead of pressure. It allows resources to go toward things that actually support a shared life. Housing, security, freedom to make choices without constant financial constraints. And ironically, those are the things that contribute far more to long-term relationship stability than any single event ever could. At some point, the framing has to shift. From how much should be spent on a wedding to what makes the most sense for the life that comes after it. Because the wedding is one day. The marriage is everything that follows, and when decisions prioritize the first at the expense of the second, the consequences tend to show up in ways that aren't immediately visible but become impossible to ignore over time. And that brings everything back to where this started. Not with the idea that weddings are bad or unnecessary, but with the reality that overspending on them carries costs that go far beyond the event itself. Costs that compound financially. Costs that compound emotionally. Costs that don't disappear when the day ends. So, before defaulting to what's expected, it's worth looking at what actually lasts. Because the most meaningful investment isn't in the event. It's in the life being built after it. If this perspective shifts how wedding spending is being thought about, take a moment to like the video and subscribe for more breakdowns like this.